So, kicking off 2025 driver ratings with the Kick Sauber team and none other than Gabriel Bortoleto, who I am going to give a 3 out of 10 for the Australian Grand Prix. So, a 3 out of 10 when he DNF'd from the race, why not a 1 or a 2? Well, Gabriel Bortoleto had a pretty strong opening weekend for the Sauber team. Out-qualifying very experienced teammate Nico Hülkenberg, I think, is a massive feat considering how well Hülkenberg was qualifying last year. Also, we do need to factor in a little bit of rookie tax in there, first race of his entire career, and the fact that the conditions were so tricky this weekend in Australia. I think he did a very good job. If you look at the race itself, he was only 4 or 5 seconds behind Hülkenberg throughout most of the race. He obviously had that big crash towards the end, but he managed to stay in the race for longer than most of the rookies on the grid. And I think, to be honest, he had a very solid opening outing. If he hadn't crashed, then this could have easily been a 6, 7 or even an 8 rating, depending on how things fleshed out with the safety car at the end. So he was quite unfortunate in a way, but of course, once you crash out of a race, your rating can't really exceed much more than a 3. So that is what I'm giving Bortoleto. His teammate Nico Hülkenberg, on the other hand, finishing all the way up in P7 for Sauber. It's going to be a 9 out of 10 from me. An unbelievable weekend considering where Sauber were throughout the entirety of the last year. He's outscored the whole Sauber team for the last year and the 2 Ferraris on his first race with the new team. Obviously massively benefited by the fact that Sauber nailed the strategy at the end of the race where other teams faltered. But you can't really say that that's a discredit to Nico Hülkenberg because he drove very well throughout the race. Obviously out-qualified by a rookie teammate, not a great look to start the weekend, but Nico in the race itself, he kept it on the track where others couldn't. He managed to get solid points for Sauber, which we don't know how they're going to get on throughout the rest of the season. It could be rare pickings for them to get points, and he did it incredibly well. I think it's great to see the fact that Sauber seem to be closer to the pack and actually mixing it up in it rather than miles off the back like last year. So hopefully Nico can continue this form forward. However, before the massive chaos at the end, it wasn't really looking like he was going to get points. So I kind of see that more being likely as to where Sauber are this season. Moving swiftly on to the Williams boys, Alex Albon to start, who I am giving a 10 out of 10. It can't be anything other than a 10 for me with Alex Albon this weekend. He had the massive pressure of a top-tier elite talent of Carlos Sainz joining the team, all the hype surrounding him. Then after testing, it looked like Williams were actually going to be really strong, so he had the pressure of a new teammate that's rapid, a car that's potentially going to be really good, brings it into qualifying and absolutely smashes it, out-qualifies Carlos Sainz, out-qualifies the 2 Ferraris, and goes on to just deliver a really clinical performance in the race, coming home in P5 in the end, which was momentarily a P4 finish before the Antonelli penalty was rescinded. Overall, just a really strong weekend for Alex Albon and the Williams team. Hopefully he can continue this performance forward and really take it to Carlos throughout the entirety of the season, because that battle could get very spicy. And speaking of the elite tier talents that's come in alongside Alex Albon, Carlos Sainz, who I'm unfortunately having to give a 1 out of 10 for this weekend. As I just mentioned, he was out-qualified by Alex Albon in the first place, and then to drop it under the safety car, I know that there was a torque surge after the upshift. It was a nasty time, but also the other drivers got through that corner fine, and he's a really experienced driver. It's partly car, but it's partly human error, and a driver of that experience to make that type of mistake under the safety car, I think you have to rate harshly, especially on a weekend where Williams, in the hands of Alex Albon, picked up massive points. And they were saying themselves the track in Melbourne favoured their car quite heavily. We don't know how they're going to perform this weekend in China. If this was the big opportunity for Williams to get points early in the season, Carlos dropping it on the first lap definitely doesn't help them out. They obviously can take the positives of this weekend forward. I mean, Williams look way stronger than last year, and Carlos will be hoping that he can turn around this performance into something better. So overall, good showings for Williams, but one to forget for Carlos Sainz. So moving on to RB now with Isaac Hadjar, the next of the rookies to discuss. I'm going to give Isaac a 2 out of 10. Really unfortunate drops it on the formation lap. In most other scenarios, I'd be given a 1 out of 10 for dropping it on the formation lap. However, the fact that Isaac qualified pretty strongly, the strongest of the rookies, up in P11, was pretty close to Yuki Tsunoda, could have been a Q3 on another day. It was a good showing up until that point, but dropping it on the formation lap, it's really unlucky. He was obviously absolutely devastated afterwards. I think there are positives to take from this weekend for Isaac. Obviously, his qualifying performance, managed to complete practice with no falters. The conditions obviously getting the better of him, and he'll be hoping to move forward into China and have a complete overturn and a much better result. And you'd hope that he would be able to, because the conditions are unlikely to be as bad as they were in Australia. And then Yuki Tsunoda for RB, I'm going to give an 8 out of 10 to. A really solid weekend for Yuki was kind of undone by the fact that the RB team just decided not to pit him at the right time at the end of the race. Qualifying, unbelievable, to outqualify both Ferraris and Alex Albon in the Williams car that was looking imperious as a midfield team. And then to go into the race, hold down that position for most of it, up until the end. I think Yuki Tsunoda had a really strong weekend, and the P12 result really doesn't reflect that at all. So I'm hoping that he will be able to take confidence in the fact that he was really strong this weekend. The result didn't come, but hopefully they can take that into the next race. And I think that the battle between Yuki Tsunoda and the Williams boys should be really interesting throughout this season if they can continue the performance that we saw in Australia. Moving on to the Haas team now, Oliver Bearman to start, who I am going to give a 4 out of 10 to. Oh, what a messy weekend by Ollie Bearman. The practice sessions were just non-existent. Bins it in FP1, can't compete in FP2. FP3 bins it on his first run. So to come into the race and actually finish it is quite impressive. Obviously they couldn't fix the car in time for a proper go at qualifying, so there's nothing to speak about there. In the race itself, you could say that he was just kind of safely driving around at the back. It didn't really look like he was competing against any other driver, but that's kind of fair enough. He needed the running after those aforementioned practice sessions. It's a rough opening weekend for Ollie Bearman. I think if that race had happened and only one person had DNF'd, this rating would be a lot lower. But the fact that he did actually get to the end of the race in a race where so many others faltered, it is a 4 out of 10, but he's lucky. And then on the other side of the garage, Esteban Ocon, who I am going to give a 5 out of 10 to. I think if the Haas performance continues as it was in Australia, they're going to be incredibly hard to rate throughout the season because they are just off the back and there's not really too much of a marker to go against. Obviously, Esteban's teammate Ollie Bearman binned it a lot. Esteban managed to keep it on track, but you'd expect him to. He's a seasoned Formula 1 driver at this point, but he wasn't really showing any pace that allows you to rate any higher than this. In qualifying, off the back of the pack with Liam Lawson 6/10 off of Nico Hülkenberg, so it's really hard to give him any sort of meaningful rating. What I will say is that he's come into the team and he hasn't allowed Ollie Bearman to outperform him, which is a solid start, and he didn't bin it throughout the sessions, which you kind of expect once again, but he had to do it, he had to keep it on the track, and so I'm going to give him a 5 out of 10 for this weekend. Okay, the Alpine team next, Jack Doohan. I'm going to give him a 2 out of 10. It's an unfortunate one for Jack Doohan. With all the pressure going on, he really didn't need this lap 1 DNF from the race. However, what I will say is that his qualifying looked pretty good. In the practice sessions as well, he was pretty close to Pierre Gasly. And then Q1, he actually outqualified Gasly. In Q2, his run was nullified by yellow flags. So he could have qualified even better than he actually did. So he had a solid Saturday. And then in the race itself, the conditions are incredibly tricky. He bins it on the first lap. It's tough to see, but you can't really give any more than a 2 out of 10 for a performance like that. I think it's quite similar to Isaac Hadjar in the way that the qualifying performance brings him up to a 2 out of 10, but then binning it that early in the race, you can't really give any more. But I think that Jack Doohan can take some confidence in the fact that he looked quite quick this weekend, and hopefully in China he can have a clean weekend get maybe a point on the board, depending on where Alpine are, and hopefully nullify some of that pressure from the likes of Colapinto and the team from outside. And then Pierre Gasly for Alpine, I'm going to give a 7 out of 10 to this weekend. It wasn't an imperious Pierre Gasly performance like we were seeing towards the end of last season, but it was solid. He was running in the tail end of the points, obviously got through into Q3, which was a massive statement at the start of the weekend. And then in the race itself, he's running in the tail end of the points. It's looking like it's going pretty well. And then after the final safety car, unfortunately, he made that mistake at turn 1, which allowed both Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton through down to one mistake. And then Oscar Piastri, who was recovering from his mistake, managed to get past him, dropping him down to P11. I mean, they're all cars that you'd expect really to be in front of Pierre anyway, so it's really not a bad performance. A 7 out of 10 is still a solid rating, but it can't be really any more than that given where the likes of Hülkenberg, Stroll, etc. were finishing in this race. Aston Martin next, Lance Stroll to start, and it's going to be an 8 out of 10 for me. Lance qualified pretty strongly. He was very close to Alonso in the Q2 session. They both obviously dropped out in that session, and then in the race itself, he was kind of running in tandem with Alonso, but by the time that Fernando crashed out of the race, he was actually a whole 14 seconds behind him. So I think the end of the race chaos really did benefit him. He maybe lucked into the result that he got. But the fact is that in the rain, you normally expect a massive crash from Lance Stroll at some point, a customary Stroll crash. And he managed to keep it out the barriers for the entirety of the weekend, put in a really solid showing and picked up some amazing points for Aston Martin in a season where we're not sure where they're going to be. I think you have to commend Lance on the weekends where he does do well, because we are very quick to criticise him, so we have to appreciate when he has a decent enough weekend as well. And I am wholly aware of the fact that he was outperformed by Fernando Alonso this weekend. If Alonso finishes that race, then it looks like a much worse performance by Lance Stroll, but the fact is he didn't. Lance Stroll did manage to finish the race, so I have to give him a high rating. And then Fernando Alonso, as I mentioned, crashed out of the race. I'm going to give him a 3 out of 10. Crashing out of the race obviously brings your rating massively down, but he was having a solid performance up until then. As I mentioned, outqualified Stroll, was outperforming him in the race pretty heavily, but unfortunately he binned it on lap 30. When the weekend started, especially in qualifying, I remember seeing Q1, him just like topping the timings and putting in purple sectors. It looked like Aston Martin had been sandbagging throughout the entirety of the winter test and practice sessions, and he was going to be up there, but unfortunately kind of toppled down the order as the sessions went on. And then, yeah, in the race itself, crashed out. Can't give him any more than a 3, unfortunately. Okay, top 4 teams time. Mercedes up first with Kimi Antonelli. I'm going to give him a 9 out of 10. You might think 9 out of 10, that's pretty high considering he qualified all the way down in 16th. And he was very fortunate in the way that the end of the race played out, so that he jumped up many positions. However, what I will say is, qualifying, he was quite unlucky in the way that his floor broke after going off at turn 6. Many drivers were going off at that corner and coming off unscathed, so for his car to break as he made that mistake was quite unfortunate, but it was his mistake that put him down there, so I do take that into consideration. However, the rookie tax, pretty strong here considering the conditions, considering how the other rookies fared in this race. Kimi Antonelli performed incredibly well in the wet. We probably should have expected that based on his junior career and how he's performed in the wet up until this point in his career, but he was super strong, making moves, some of the only ones we saw in the race. And his move on Alex Albon to take 4th in the race, it's absolutely sublime. It wasn't shown on TV, I don't think, but if you can watch that back, make sure you do, because it is absolutely sublime. And I think overall, for Kimi to come through like he did, finish just behind George Russell in the end, it can't really be anything other than a 9 out of 10. And then on the other side of the Mercedes garage, George Russell, also going to give a 9 out of 10 to just a really clinical performance throughout the entirety of the weekend. We don't really know where the performance of the cars are right now, based on the fact that Antonelli was down, Lawson was down in qualifying, but George Russell, it looked like, maximised the performance of the Mercedes this weekend, qualifying in P4 behind only the McLarens and Verstappen, who looked very strong this weekend, and then to come home on the podium in the race. No mistakes throughout the entirety of the race. It's a really solid weekend for George Russell, the type that you expect from him based on what we've seen from him as a driver so far, and that is the highest of compliments because it looks like George is going to be really strong this weekend. Unfortunately, it doesn't really look like Mercedes are going to be strong enough to fight right at the front, and if they were, then I think that George could take it to the likes of Verstappen and Norris. However, it doesn't really look like they're there yet. We'll see this weekend, of course, but it's going to be a 9 out of 10 for both Mercedes drivers. Solid weekend for both of them. The Red Bull team now, starting off with Liam Lawson. I'm unfortunately going to have to give him a 2 out of 10. On his opening weekend with the Red Bull team. Throughout the practice sessions, he was struggling for grip on most of his laps. Didn't really look like he was at one with the car at any stage throughout the weekend. What I will say is that he did have a different front end of the car to Max Verstappen, so it wasn't an absolute representative car between the two drivers, but to be that far off your teammate is unfortunately never going to look that good on you, even if it is Max Verstappen who you expect to be absolutely miles in front of everyone. Liam just really struggled this weekend and then topped it off with the crash in the race. It's really hard to give him any higher of a rating based on his qualifying performance being very bad and the race obviously crashing in it. He didn't make much progress in the race before crashing. A really bad weekend overall, if we're being honest. The only reason that it's a 2 rather than a 1 is because of a bit of that rookie tax. But yeah, one to forget for Liam Lawson, and I hope, to be honest, in China he can turn it around. And then Max Verstappen, of course, finished second in the race. I'm going to give him a 9 out of 10 this weekend. Looks like the only man that can really challenge the McLarens this weekend, so hopefully Red Bull can keep the car performance up so that he is allowed to fight them, because without that, it's just going to be a straight McLaren v McLaren fight. And that is not what we were promised this season. It was supposed to be Ferrari, McLaren, Verstappen, maybe even Russell fighting. So hopefully Verstappen can at least keep it up there. His performance in qualifying was really strong, up there with the McLarens, as I mentioned. And then in the race itself, obviously took Oscar Piastri at the second corner, round the outside, beautiful move. His only real mistake of the whole weekend was him going wide at turn 17, allowing Oscar Piastri back through. But the fact that he had kept Piastri behind for that long, based on how fast the McLarens were, was just very strong in itself. And then at the end of the race, after he'd been left out a little bit too long on the dry tyres and managed to sustain his position up the field, he was putting massive pressure on Lando Norris for the win. It looked like if Lando made a mistake, then Verstappen definitely would have been winning that race, but Lando didn't falter. We'll get onto him later. But Verstappen had a very strong weekend overall. The reason that it's a 9, not a 10, is because Verstappen obviously brings this expectation of a 4-time world champion. He has to do something extraordinary to get a 10 out of 10 at this point, which would have been winning the race. So I think a 9 out of 10 is fair for him. Okay, the Ferrari boys now. We're kicking off with Lewis Hamilton. I'm going to give him a 6 out of 10 for this weekend. A bit of a shaky start to his life at Ferrari. Obviously, very difficult conditions for him to contend with, and he did manage to at least close the gap between himself and Charles Leclerc as the weekend went on. The gap came down from FP1 all the way through to qualifying, and then in the race itself, towards the end, he was battling with Charles. But realistically, the pace over the course of the weekend wasn't incredibly strong from Lewis at any point. Driving a new car in the wet is never going to be easy for him, but coming home in P10, it's the worst debut performance of a Ferrari driver in like 16 years, I think I read, so can't really be any higher than a 6 for Lewis. Because, like Max, Lewis is an incredibly experienced driver in Formula 1. The expectations are just going to be that bit higher for him. So when he's finishing down in P10, even though it is a brand new team, very difficult conditions, I can only give him a 6 for this weekend. And on the other side of the Ferrari garage, Charles Leclerc, I am going to give a 7 out of 10 to. Leclerc obviously outperformed Lewis Hamilton throughout the entirety of the weekend. I think that was expected of him, but it is good that he did. He did need to kind of assert himself as the #1 driver for this season, and if it continues as it did last weekend, then he definitely will be that. Of course, we are expecting Lewis to get to grips with that car a bit more and maybe challenge more towards the mid to end point of the season, but Charles did keep Lewis behind. Ferrari were a lot weaker this weekend than everyone was expecting, I think. And so when they were qualifying that far down, it's hard for Charles to really make an impression on the front of the grid. He had that spin midway through the race, dropping in behind Lewis for a little section of the race. Thankfully for him, he just sent it round to the outside of the first corner on the safety car restart, retaking that position and reaffirming his status as being faster than Lewis this weekend, which was good. However, that mistake and the fact that he didn't really have electrifying pace throughout the weekend means that it has to be a 7 out of 10 for Charles. And then the final team to talk about, McLaren, starting with Oscar Piastri. I'm gonna give him an 8 out of 10, which might seem ridiculously high for a man that finished all the way down in P9 in the clearly fastest car this weekend. However, Oscar Piastri was really close to Lando Norris in qualifying, obviously qualified on the front row. And then when it came to being in the race itself, after Verstappen made his mistake on lap 17, Oscar was absolutely rapid, pulled right the way up to the back of Lando Norris, put him under some massive pressure before the team used team orders to say that he had to hold position, and it was at that point he started to drop back. So I think, to be honest, if Oscar and Lando were allowed to race at that point, the complexion of the entirety of the rest of the race could have looked incredibly different for Oscar. Obviously, with him staying behind, that maybe dented his confidence a little bit because he had the momentum at that stage. And then, of course, the big mistake that dropped him all the way down the field. It was the exact same mistake that Lando Norris had just made in front of him, but the way that he came back onto the track was a little bit more unfortunate. I think Piastri did well to recover the car back up to P9, obviously not where he would want to finish, and a bit devastating considering it was his home race. But I think that the positives that we can take from this as fans is the fact that Piastri looks like he can take it to Lando Norris this year, versus what we saw last year where Lando seemed to have the edge over him at most times. Piastri this weekend was really close to Norris, and I really hope that he can turn it around this weekend in China and continue to put the pressure on, because we want a lovely title fight. And then lastly, and certainly not leastly, Lando Norris. It's a 10 out of 10 for him this weekend. Pole position, fastest lap, race win. Can't be anything other than a 10 out of 10, really. He was rapid throughout every single session. Of course, he did have the fastest car, but you have to still drive the fastest car to win the race. He drove it very well. He didn't make any mistakes under pressure. The big pressure that he had at the end, especially from Max Verstappen. I feel like Lando of last year, we could have seen a few more mistakes. Actually, just remember that, of course, he did make the same mistake as Piastri, but he managed to keep it on the track, and he managed to continue on and win the race. So for me, it's going to be a 10 out of 10 for Lando Norris. And on the screen right now, you can see all of my ratings in order from best to worst. And my driver of the weekend, who I am going to give to Alex Albon this weekend. Again, like I mentioned earlier, the pressure from Carlos Sainz, the pressure from Williams actually having a good car finally, and he put it all together for a beautiful P5 finish. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you after the Chinese Grand Prix.